You people are here to clean, not to check in. Those were the first words out of the receptionist's mouth, sharp, deliberate, and loud enough to turn every head in the gold-trimmed lobby of the Hotel Sacher in Vienna. The woman didn't whisper it. She didn't hesitate. She stood tall behind the carved walnut check-in desk, her perfectly ironed navy blazer and silk scarf glowing under the chandelier light as she stared down the woman standing in front of her. "Ma'am, housekeeping uses the service entrance," she added, with a fake smile stretching across her face like it had been rehearsed. The guest she was speaking to, an elegant black woman dressed in a gray wool coat, tailored slacks, and polished low heels, didn't respond right away. She blinked slowly. Behind her, the grand marble staircase seemed to fall silent. To some in the room, the receptionist's words were awkward. To others, they were invisible. But to the woman who had just traveled 4,300 miles to get here, they were nothing short of humiliating. Before we go any further, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe no one should be judged by how they look, especially in a place that claims luxury and heritage, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us. What happens next will challenge everything you think you know about class, bias, and justice in one of Europe's most exclusive hotels. Now, let's rewind to just 10 minutes before those words were spoken. The woman who had just been mistaken for housekeeping was Dr. Naomi Pierce, 43 years old, the founder and CEO of Phoenix Lux Group, a hospitality empire that had quietly acquired a controlling interest in the Sacher Hotels brand less than a year ago. Naomi had built her company from the ground up, starting with one boutique property in Charleston and growing it into a global network of luxury destinations across 4 continents. But this trip to Vienna wasn't for ribbon cuttings or shareholder meetings. Naomi had come unannounced, under a reservation placed in the name N. Johnson, to investigate a string of quiet complaints she'd received from guests of color who reported being followed, dismissed, or treated as if they didn't belong. She chose Vienna specifically because of the hotel's history. The Sacher brand was over 140 years old, legendary for its cakes, its chandeliers, and its wealthy clientele, and also because, despite all its beauty, it had never had a woman of color on its executive board, let alone walking its halls as owner. Naomi had landed at 7:25 on a transatlantic flight from New York, having only told one person, her deputy COO, Kevin Ross, about the real purpose of her visit. She wore no jewelry aside from a slim silver watch and a wedding band. Her hair was in a neat bun, her voice was calm, and her demeanor didn't command attention, but it didn't apologize for itself, either. She'd entered the lobby at 9:02 passing rows of marble columns and high society oil paintings, and approached the front desk with quiet confidence. The receptionist, whose nameplate read Rebecca Dalton, had smiled politely at first, but that smile faded the moment she saw Naomi's skin. When Naomi offered her name, Rebecca didn't even type. She just tilted her head and said, "Are you with the kitchen staff?" Naomi paused, then repeated herself, "Reservation under N. Johnson. Early check-in confirmed." Rebecca finally began typing, slowly, then sighed. "I'm sorry. I don't see anything here." Naomi reached into her bag and pulled out a printout with the confirmation number, dates, and signature of the front desk manager. But Rebecca didn't even look. Instead, she leaned in closer and said, "Ma'am, are you sure you're not confused? Housekeeping arrives at the back entrance. This counter is for guests." Then came the final blow. "You people are here to clean, not to check in." There it was. Not a misunderstanding. Not a mistake. A message. One delivered not by accident, but with intention. Naomi felt the heat rise in her chest, not from anger, but from pain. from the heavy familiarity of being seen as less than in places she had built with her own hands. She stayed silent for a moment, blinking at the receptionist, watching her stand there with folded arms and a smirk that said, "What are you going to do about it?" Naomi slowly reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and dialed one number. Only one. "Kevin," she said when he picked up. "I'm at the Sacher Vienna. Activate the full protocol. I want the general manager, the regional head, and legal on standby. Lock down the staff list. No one clocks out until I'm done." She hung up, smiled softly, and said to Rebecca, "Thank you for your honesty." Then she turned and walked calmly out of the lobby, her low heels echoing across the marble like a warning shot. For most people, being treated like that would have ruined their trip. For Naomi, it opened the door to something far greater. In 10 minutes, she would walk back through those same doors, not as a stranger, not as a presumed housekeeper, but as the woman who owned the building, who signed the payroll, and who was about to change every rule this hotel had followed for over a century, the woman they tried to dismiss that morning, the one they assumed had come through the wrong entrance, in the wrong clothes, with the wrong skin color, was the same woman who'd built a $2.3 billion hospitality empire from nothing but grit, brilliance, and an old notebook filled with hotel sketches she drew in her dorm room back at Howard University. Dr. Naomi Pierce wasn't just another CEO. She was the kind of leader who remembered the names of every night janitor in her headquarters building, who sat in the back row during conferences so she could observe the way people treated servers. Born in Detroit to a mother who cleaned offices at night and a father who worked double shifts at a stamping plant. Naomi had spent her childhood watching people get treated differently for how they looked and how they spoke. She never forgot the way her mom was once asked to use the back elevator in a hotel they couldn't afford to stay in. She remembered how her dad's name never made it onto the promotion board, even after 18 years without a single missed day. And so, when Naomi graduated with honors, earned her MBA at Columbia, and decided to enter the hospitality industry, it wasn't just about building hotels. It was about changing who hotels welcomed and how they served. Her first property had been a tiny 5-room inn outside Charleston that no one took seriously. But Naomi brought in local chefs, trained her own staff, handled every complaint herself, and within 2 years, she had a waiting list stretching out 3 months. Word spread, investors followed, and over the next 15 years, Phoenix Lux Group rose from a passion project to a global powerhouse, with locations in London, Marrakesh, Seoul, and now, Vienna. When Phoenix acquired a 60% controlling interest in the Sacher Hotel Group, it had been a quiet deal. The Austrian brand, known for its 19th-century glamour and famously protected chocolate cake recipe, had been looking for capital to expand into Asia. Naomi offered more than funding. She offered a future, but she also knew that legacy brands didn't change overnight. She knew racism didn't announce itself loudly at the boardroom table. It whispered in hallways. It lived in who got offered a sweet upgrade and who got told to wait. It showed up in who was called Sir and who was called Miss or ignored altogether. And so Naomi did what she'd done a dozen times before. She showed up unannounced, under a different name. Traveling light, dressed like any business traveler who'd just gotten off a red-eye. Her reservation had been made through a secure internal system under the name N. Johnson, a variation of her mother's maiden name, just like always. She wanted no red carpet, no branding package, no logoed notepad waiting on the nightstand. What she wanted, what she needed, was to see how the staff at Hotel Sacher treated a black woman who didn't appear wealthy, powerful, or connected. She'd done this same test in Los Angeles, in Paris, in Tokyo. Sometimes it revealed minor training gaps. Sometimes it revealed a toxic culture. But never, never had she been looked in the face and told, You people are here to clean," as she stepped outside the building. Vienna's cold morning air hit her cheeks like glass. She didn't shiver. She didn't cry. Instead, she stood just outside the historic archway, pulled out her phone again, and opened the secure folder labeled Satcher Incident Reports. Inside were 4 anonymized complaints sent to Phoenix's Guest Experience Division over the last 7 months. All from guests of color, all brushed off by the local managers, all with phrases like "treated with suspicion," "followed through the lobby," or "spoken to like I didn't belong." Naomi had flagged those reports personally. She'd requested retraining for the Vienna location back in April, but something inside her had told her it wasn't enough. So now she was here. Not as a guest, not as a secret shopper, but as the owner. And ownership carried responsibility. It meant she couldn't walk away, not from what had just happened, and not from what had already been happening to others for far too long. She called Kevin Ross again, her second in command, who was stationed at their European headquarters in Zurich. "I want all senior Vienna staff placed on temporary hold, no statements, no emails, no media, and have HR begin compiling incident files. You'll be on the next train," she said plainly. Kevin, who had worked alongside Naomi for 12 years, didn't ask questions. "Understood," he replied. She hung up, turned back toward the building, and took one long look at the engraved brass letters spelling out Hotel Sacher Wien. So much history, so much prestige, and still so much work to do. Naomi knew what came next wouldn't be comfortable, but change never was. What mattered now wasn't how they treated her when they knew who she was. It was how they had treated her when they thought she was nobody. That moment, that truth, was the only real audit a leader could trust. And in 10 minutes, the Hotel Sacher was going to be audited, not by spreadsheet or consultant, but by the woman whose name had been quietly placed at the top of every title deed in the portfolio. The woman who had been told she didn't belong, by people who didn't even realize they were speaking to the one person with the power to make sure they never represented the brand again. 10 minutes later, the massive glass doors of the Hotel Sacher swung open, and Dr. Naomi Pierce walked back in, not with rage, not with security, not with theatrics, but with the calm precision of a woman who had nothing to prove and everything to correct. The lobby hadn't changed. The crystal chandeliers still shimmered overhead. The air still smelled faintly of bergamot and warm pastry. The same pianist played Chopin softly near the cafe entrance, and the same guests were lounging with coffee and newspapers, most of them oblivious to the storm brewing inside the heart of this centuries-old institution. But the staff noticed Rebecca, the receptionist who had uttered those unforgettable words just minutes ago, stiffened behind the counter as soon as she saw Naomi re-enter. Her eyes widened, not in recognition of the guest's status, but in fear that something was about to go terribly wrong. She glanced behind her, nervously motioning toward the hallway leading to the manager's office. Naomi didn't pause. She walked straight up to the desk, removed her gloves slowly, and set them beside the fresh lilies on the counter. Her voice was calm but firm, the kind of voice that doesn't need to shout because it's used to being heard. "I need to speak to your general manager," she said. "Now." Rebecca opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Before she could gather the courage to speak, the night duty manager, Henry Walsh, appeared, in his 50s, dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit. Henry had the air of someone who had seen it all and wasn't impressed by much. He approached with that rehearsed European hospitality smile, the one that covered discomfort better than apology. "Is there a problem?" he asked, looking Naomi up and down like he was still trying to figure out if she was truly a guest. Naomi looked him dead in the eyes and said, "There's a situation, one that now involves legal corporate, and operational oversight. I suggest we relocate to a private room before I continue. Henry faltered just slightly. And you are? Naomi smiled softly. I'm Dr. Naomi Pierce, CEO of Phoenix Lux Group, majority shareholder of this property. And you, Mr. Walsh, have about 5 minutes to gather your senior team before this becomes a formal incident report with international consequences. The smile disappeared from his face like someone had turned off a switch. He nodded once, motioned toward the executive meeting lounge just past the concierge station, and hurried off. Rebecca nearly stumbled as she stepped back from the desk, suddenly unable to meet Naomi's eyes, but Naomi didn't even look at her. Her attention was now focused on the dozen small decisions that were about to change the future of this hotel. Once inside the lounge, a private glass-walled space with leather chairs and a sweeping view of the opera house, Naomi took a seat at the head of the table, opened her laptop, and pulled up a digital file labeled Satcher Protocol. It was a crisis action plan built for moments exactly like this, because when you're a black woman running an empire, you don't prepare for if, you prepare for when, within minutes. Several key staff members had arrived, including Angela Martin, the assistant manager on rotation, unlike the others. Angela didn't look confused. She looked relieved. She sat near Naomi and gave a tiny nod, the kind people give when they recognize an ally in a room that's never made space for them. Naomi noticed. She also noticed the way Thomas Lee, the security officer on duty, hovered near the door with uncertainty, torn between protocol and instinct. Naomi turned to him and said gently, "Mr. Lee, I'd like you to stay. What you witnessed earlier matters." He nodded slowly and took a seat along the wall. As the room settled, Henry returned. Now pale and tight-lipped, he opened his mouth to speak, but Naomi raised her hand. "Before anyone explains, I'd like to show you something." She hit play on a recording taken from the hotel's own security feed. On the screen, in perfect clarity, was the moment Naomi first approached the desk that morning, the back and forth with Rebecca, and, most damning of all, the phrase that echoed louder in silence than it ever could aloud. "You people are here to clean." No one said a word. Angela closed her eyes. Thomas exhaled sharply through his nose. Henry swallowed hard. Naomi paused the video and folded her hands in her lap. "That," she said, "is not a mistake. That's not a training issue. That's not someone having a bad day. That is systemic failure. And as of 10 minutes ago, it became your entire team's responsibility." Henry began to stammer about cultural misunderstandings, but Naomi shut it down with a quiet phrase that carried the weight of steel. "Do not explain away disrespect with diplomacy." The room fell silent again. Naomi turned to Angela. "Were you on shift when I arrived?" Angela nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I was reviewing reservations in the back office. I didn't know what was happening until it was over." Naomi tilted her head. "But you've seen similar situations before, haven't you?" Angela hesitated, then answered with honesty. "Yes, especially with older guests, and with black women. They're questioned more, asked for extra ID, sometimes even followed by housekeeping if they request late checkouts. I've flagged it twice to upper management. Nothing changed." Naomi nodded, then looked to Thomas. "Mr. Lee, when Rebecca called for security earlier, what was said?" Thomas shifted. "I was told a guest was being aggressive and trying to access rooms under a false reservation. I watched from the camera. Nothing about your behavior was threatening. And yet," Naomi said, "no one stopped it. No one stepped in." She stood slowly, laptop closed, and let the silence breathe. "That ends today." She handed Henry a printed document, immediate suspension notices for Rebecca, Henry himself, and 2 other desk supervisors pending formal review. She'd already signed them. Angela, eyes wide, blinked. Naomi turned to her and said, "Effective immediately. You are acting general manager of the Hotel Sacher Vienna. You will report directly to Kevin Ross, and you will have full authority to retrain, replace, or remove any team member who cannot meet the standard this brand now demands." Angela looked stunned, but Naomi smiled softly. "I don't reward silence. I reward courage. And you, Ms. Martin, had the courage to say what others pretend not to see." She turned to the group, her voice now crisp and resolute. "You don't fix legacy with platitudes. You fix it with accountability." And with that, Dr. Naomi Pierce walked out of the meeting room, back into the same lobby where 10 minutes earlier she'd been mistaken for the help, now leaving behind her a team that had just been introduced to what real leadership looks like. The staff had barely recovered from the shock of Naomi's return before the second wave of accountability began. And this time, it came with evidence that couldn't be denied, talked over, or swept into a drawer. An hour after the emergency meeting, Naomi remained seated in the executive lounge, now joined by Kevin Ross, her second-in-command, who had arrived from Zurich on the first available train, calm and observant as always. Kevin sat quietly beside her as she opened a second laptop and pulled up a secure folder titled Unresolved Guest Incidents, Vienna. On the screen were 4 internal guest reports, all filed within the past 7 months, all describing experiences nearly identical to Naomi's own. Black and brown guests being treated with suspicion, offered downgraded rooms, followed by security, denied early check-in, or told outright that they didn't fit the hotel's image. These complaints hadn't been discarded. Naomi had flagged them herself, marked them for escalation, and requested investigation, only to receive back formal replies from the Vienna management team, assuring her that the guests misunderstood. The staff acted within protocol, or worst of all, no corrective action is necessary at this time. Now, sitting in the very room where those choices had been made, she tapped a button and cast the screen onto the wall-mounted monitor so everyone could see. Each report came with a timestamp, a staff name, a room number, and in 2 of the cases, attached video clips from the hotel's security feed. The room fell into silence as they watched a black couple being followed by a concierge from the elevator to their suite. Then a South Asian woman being told at breakfast she wasn't on the guest list, even though her room was under her name. Naomi didn't speak during the playback. She let the footage speak for itself. When it ended, she turned toward Henry Walsh, still seated stiffly across from her, his tie now loosened, his composure fading. "Tell me," she said evenly, "what part of the Phoenix Lux training manual suggests that hotel security is allowed to monitor guests based on skin tone?" Henry opened his mouth to respond, but Naomi raised a single hand and added, "And before you try to blame it on overvigilance or miscommunication, please note that your team signed acknowledgement of anti-bias training not once, but 3 separate times. That includes you." Henry looked down. "It was never supposed to be this way," he muttered, as if the past could be rewritten by saying it out loud. "Intent," Naomi replied, "means nothing without action. Hospitality isn't about gold keys and bellboys. It's about who feels seen, safe, and welcome. You failed at all 3. Her voice was calm, controlled, but her eyes held the kind of quiet fire that only comes from years of being underestimated. She then opened another file. One Rebecca Dalton had never expected anyone to see. It was a private Slack message, leaked anonymously to HR, sent 2 months earlier during a staff training session. In it, Rebecca had messaged another front desk associate, "Let's be real. We all know who the problem guests are. It's always the Americans who walk in like they own the place, especially the loud ones who show up early wearing fake designer bags. Half the time they're influencers or scammers. Honestly, they should be flagged before they get a key. The screen went still. No one moved. Angela Martin's face flushed red with embarrassment. Not for herself, but for the building she had worked in with pride for 5 years. Thomas Lee, the security guard, dropped his gaze to the carpet. Even Kevin, usually stoic, exhaled through his nose and shook his head slightly. Naomi closed the laptop and folded her hands. There is no excuse. Not anymore. Then she turned to Angela. Ms. Martin, how many formal guest complaints were submitted through you or your team that never made it to my desk? Angela looked conflicted but didn't lie. I submitted 6. I escalated 3 personally to Henry. Naomi turned her head slowly toward him. And how many did you forward? Henry looked like a man unraveling from the inside. None, he admitted. I didn't want to start a panic. Naomi stared at him for a moment, then said simply, You chose silence over truth. And then she stood. Let me be perfectly clear, she said, her voice now filling the room without ever rising. Phoenix Lux did not invest in Sacker to preserve its velvet curtains or chandelier nostalgia. We invested to raise the standard of what legacy hospitality should look like in this century. That means no guest, no matter their race, their nationality, or the cut of their coat, should ever feel like they don't belong in a space built for the world's elite. Because the elite now looks different. It includes women. It includes people of color. It includes people who weren't born into luxury, but who built it from nothing. She turned her gaze back toward the team. This is not a debate. As of now, all staff involved in these incidents are suspended pending review. That includes you, Mr. Walsh. Effective immediately. Angela Martin will assume interim management of this location. Angela's eyes widened, but Naomi offered her a reassuring nod. You've reported wrongdoing when it wasn't popular. That's leadership. Now I want to see what you can do with the authority to fix it. She then looked to Kevin. We'll begin the full audit tomorrow. I want every guest policy, hiring practice, and back-of-house protocol reviewed line by line, and I want a report on every formal complaint filed in the past 5 years, regardless of outcome. Kevin nodded silently. Naomi gathered her coat and gloves, then turned to the room one last time. Let this be the last day that any guest walks through these doors and is treated like a stranger in their own booking. And with that, she left the room, leaving behind a silence heavier than gold leaf and older than the empire this hotel once served. For the first time in decades, the Hotel Sacker Vienna was being held accountable, not to its past, but to its future. By noon, word had already begun to ripple through the halls of the Hotel Sacker, not through press releases or memos, but through glances exchanged in linen closets and whispers passed between waiters and bellhops. Something had shifted. A line had been drawn. And for the first time, it wasn't drawn between guests and staff. It was drawn between what was tolerated and what would never be allowed again. Upstairs in the executive office, Michael Rivers, the front desk manager who'd been on scheduled leave that morning, had rushed back after a cryptic text from a colleague. You need to be here. Now. He walked through the grand corridor like a man trying to hold on to power with every step, his shoulders back, his chin raised, but his eyes gave him away. He knew something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. He found Naomi seated in the same lounge as before, now joined by Kevin Ross and 2 HR officials flown in from the London regional office. Naomi didn't look up when Michael entered. She continued reviewing the internal staff directory, highlighting names and roles. While HR read through Rebecca Dalton's personnel file, Michael cleared his throat. Dr. Pierce, he began. I understand there's been some kind of misunderstanding this morning. I'm not sure what was said, but I'd like a chance to explain. Naomi cut him off with a single glance. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even angry. It was the look of someone who had already read the ending to a book someone else was still pretending to write. "Mr. Rivers," she said evenly, "you were the one who signed off on Rebecca's promotion 3 months ago, correct?" Michael hesitated. "Yes, but that was based on her performance. She's very efficient." "Efficient," Naomi repeated softly. "At what? Exactly?" She pulled out a thin manila folder and opened it. "Because the efficiency I see here includes turning away early check-ins from black guests 71% of the time." 71. Do you know how statistically absurd that is? Mr. Rivers? Michael shifted in his seat. I wasn't aware of that data. But you were aware of the complaints," Kevin added quietly. "And you dismissed them," Naomi continued. "You may not have used the words yourself, but when you create a culture where they can be spoken without shock, you are complicit." Michael opened his mouth, closed it again, then leaned forward, lowering his voice as if trying to appeal to some shared understanding. "Look, I've worked in luxury hospitality for 18 years. I know what our clientele expects. They have certain standards." "And you assumed," Naomi interrupted, "that people who look like me don't meet them." There was no venom in her tone, just truth. A plain, irrefutable truth. Michael sat back, finally silent. Naomi slid a document across the table. "Effective immediately. You are suspended pending further review. You are not to return to the property without written approval. Your access codes have already been revoked." She moved on without waiting for a response. In another room, Rebecca Dalton was crying, loudly. HR had reviewed her messages, her performance history, and the video recordings, and there was no saving her. Naomi had requested that she be allowed to resign quietly to avoid public disgrace, but even that mercy felt heavier than it should have. Angela Martin, now acting general manager, had been tasked with informing Rebecca in person. She did so with dignity, even offering tissues when Rebecca refused to make eye contact. "I didn't mean it like that," Rebecca whispered between tears. "It was just a moment. A stupid moment." Angela didn't respond with platitudes. She simply said, "A moment like that can shape how someone sees themselves for the rest of their life. And you've had too many of those moments for it to be an accident." Meanwhile, in the main dining salon, a different kind of reckoning was unfolding. Diane Green, a longtime VIP guest, known for her generous tips and icy demeanor, was seated near the window enjoying a late breakfast. She had watched the earlier commotion from a distance and had already sent an email to the concierge requesting clarity on what she called all this diversity drama. What she didn't know was that Naomi had read that email herself, and what Diane certainly didn't expect was to be approached. Moments later, by Kevin Ross and a hotel security officer. "Mrs. Green," Kevin began politely, "your reservation has been refunded in full. We'll be happy to arrange transportation to another property. Should you wish—" Diane blinked in disbelief. "Excuse me? Are you asking me to leave?" Kevin remained courteous but firm. "Your conduct towards staff and your comments on record no longer align with the values of the Satcher brand under new leadership." Diane's voice rose. "I've been coming here for 14 years. Do you have any idea who I am?" "Yes," Kevin replied calmly. "And we also know who we are, and who we refuse to be." Within the hour, Diane was escorted to a waiting black town car, and for the first time, the staff didn't whisper apologies. They watched it happen in quiet agreement. Later that afternoon, Naomi and Angela walked the property together, floor by floor, hallway by hallway, not with the eyes of critics, but with the eyes of caretakers. Naomi listened as Angela outlined ideas for retraining, plans for anonymous feedback boxes, and a revised code of conduct. "Make the lobby feel like neutral ground," Angela said. "Not a museum for rich people." Naomi smiled. "I want it to feel like a promise kept." As they passed the back corridor where Naomi had first been mistaken for staff, she paused. The hallway was quiet now. Sunlight poured in through the tall windows. And for a moment, the building didn't feel heavy with history. It felt ready for something better, ready for something earned. She turned to Angela and said, "This was never about revenge. It was always about responsibility." And with that, Naomi gave the order for a full system reset. Guest policies, staff expectations, training logs, all to be rebuilt from the ground up, not in silence, but in the open, where every guest and every employee would know the days of quiet injustice were over. Not just at the Hotel Sacher, but everywhere Phoenix Lux planted its flag. The following days at the Hotel Sacher felt like standing at the edge of a long overdue storm, one that had already blown through but left the air thick with questions. For some, like Angela Martin and the housekeeping staff, it felt like sunrise after years of fog. But for others, those used to coasting on privilege, shortcuts, or silence, it felt like a reckoning they never thought would reach them. Among those was Michael Rivers, who requested a private meeting with Naomi just 48 hours after his suspension. He arrived dressed carefully, in a navy suit and tie, trying to reclaim the composure of a man who once ran the front desk like a symphony. Naomi agreed to meet him in one of the quiet lounges off the main hallway, not out of obligation, but because she believed in hearing people out, even when they hadn't earned it. As he sat down, he avoided her eyes at first. "Dr. Pierce," he began, "I've had some time to reflect. I'm not here to beg for my job, but I do want to explain that none of what happened was intentional. I was trying to maintain standards." Naomi listened without interruption. Her hands were folded, her eyes steady. She didn't flinch when he said, "standards." She simply waited. "You have to understand," he continued. "We're trained to look for warning signs, people who seem out of place, who might cause problems. I thought I was protecting the brand." Naomi finally spoke. "And your warning signs," she said slowly, "tended to come with melanin." Michael looked wounded but didn't protest. Naomi continued, her tone measured. "You thought you were protecting the brand, but what you were protecting was an outdated image, one that told the wrong people they weren't welcome unless they looked a certain way, walked a certain way, spoke a certain way, and that is not what luxury means anymore." Michael sighed, the fight draining out of him. "I guess I just didn't see it." "No," Naomi replied. "You didn't want to see it, because seeing it would have meant changing." She stood and gathered her things. "You won't be returning to the Sacher, but what you do with this lesson is up to you. This isn't revenge, Mr. Rivers. It's accountability." As Michael stood to leave, he offered a quiet, "Thank you for meeting with me." And Naomi, ever gracious even in disappointment, simply nodded. Meanwhile, in a different corner of the hotel, Angela Martin had begun the slow, necessary work of transformation. Staff members who had once looked past her now looked to her. She held daily meetings with each department, not just to review tasks, but to rebuild culture. In one of her sessions, she said, "I don't want politeness. I want respect. The difference is that respect doesn't disappear when no one's watching." Her words struck chords, especially among the staff who had spent years trying to keep their heads down just to survive the hierarchy. Carla Evans, the housekeeping supervisor, had tears in her eyes when she told Angela, I used to think I'd retire here and never be seen. You changed that. But not everyone was ready for change. Some employees submitted resignations quietly. Others voiced concerns anonymously, accusing leadership of overcorrecting, of turning the hotel into a social experiment. Naomi read every complaint, not because she feared them, but because she understood something deeper. Real reform always comes with resistance. That same week, Naomi received a call from Diane Green's attorney, inquiring whether the guest ban was permanent. Naomi's response was short and final. Disrespect is not a matter of opinion. It's a breach of trust. There is no room for that here. Not anymore. But the most surprising request came from Rebecca Dalton, the former receptionist who had triggered the chain of events. Through HR, she sent a letter, not a legal rebuttal, not a defense, but an apology. Handwritten, 4 pages long. In it, she wrote, "I said something awful because it was easy, because no one ever made me look in the mirror long enough to see what I'd become. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I see it now." Naomi didn't respond immediately, but she saved the letter, not to soften her resolve, but to remind herself that some people don't change because they're forced to. They change because they're finally shown the truth, and they have the courage to face it. Kevin Ross, watching the transformation from the sidelines, told Naomi over breakfast, "What you're doing here, it's bigger than this place. It's bigger than chocolate cakes and polished silverware." Naomi smiled softly. "It has to be," she replied, "because it's not just about this hotel. It's about every black woman who's ever stood at a front desk and been asked, 'Are you sure you have a reservation?' It's about every father turned away because he didn't look like a guest. This place may wear chandeliers and white gloves, but beneath it all, it tells a story. And now, we're rewriting it." The first big test came sooner than expected. A travel blogger, black, queer, well known in social justice circles, booked a last-minute stay under a public name. Naomi flagged it instantly but gave no instructions to the staff. She wanted to see what happened organically. The blogger arrived at 3 p.m. on a Thursday. No fuss. Just a tired traveler with a suitcase and a camera bag. He was greeted by a young front desk agent who had just finished Angela's new training. The guest was checked in, offered coffee, and personally walked to the elevator. Not because he was famous, but because he was a guest. When the blogger posted his review 2 days later, it read simply, "The hotel Sasher didn't know who I was. They just treated me like I mattered. That's the future of hospitality." Naomi read it on her phone while standing on the hotel's rooftop terrace, looking out over Vienna. The bells of St. Stephen's Cathedral echoed in the distance. Below her, a hotel she now believed in again. She took a breath, deep and full, not of pride, but of peace. Because change had come, not with rage, not with headlines, but with honesty, grace, and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be erased. 6 weeks after the morning Dr. Naomi Pierce was told, "You people don't belong at the Hotel Sasher." The world outside the hotel had changed, but the bigger change had taken root within its walls. The marble still gleamed, the chandeliers still sparkled, and the Sasher torte was still served on fine bone china. But something deeper had shifted, not in the appearance of the place, but in its soul. Guests who had once expected silent servitude now met staff who stood tall and spoke with purpose. Employees who once hid behind lowered eyes now walked through the lobby with dignity in every step. Naomi had never intended to stay long, but she delayed her departure for one final day, not for herself, but for the people who were still watching closely, unsure if the change was real or just performative. That morning, she requested a short all-staff meeting in the main salon. No suits, no formalities, just the team, Housekeeping, front desk, kitchen, concierge, maintenance, everyone. When the clock struck 10, they gathered. Some nervous, some curious. All quiet. Naomi stood at the front. No notes in her hands. Just truth in her voice. "I didn't come here to be welcomed," she began. "I came here to see the truth." Her eyes moved across the room, landing on faces she had come to know. Carla Evans, who ran the tightest linen room in Europe. Jamal, the Nigerian bellhop who spoke 5 languages and had once been mistaken for a cab driver by a guest. And even Sophia, the shy breakfast hostess who now smiled with confidence and looked guests in the eye. "The first thing I saw," Naomi continued, "was the rot hiding behind polished wood. But the second thing I saw was all of you." She paused, letting that land. "I saw people who had been surviving, enduring, people who knew what was wrong but didn't feel safe enough to speak." Her voice never wavered, but it carried the weight of something bigger than any one person. Leadership isn't about position, it's about courage. And what I've seen over the last 6 weeks is real courage. People stepping into the light, choosing to be better, choosing to see each other. And that is the future of the Hotel Satcher. Murmurs of quiet agreement rippled through the staff. Naomi smiled gently and said, "I'm not staying. This place doesn't need a shadow watching over it. It needs a heart leading it forward. And I've already found the person who will do that." She turned to Angela Martin. The room erupted in applause. Angela's eyes filled with tears, but her chin lifted proudly. "You've seen her work. You've felt her spirit. You know what she stands for. She's not here to tear down your traditions. She's here to elevate your values. Together, you're going to build something that lasts." After the meeting, Naomi walked the hotel one last time. Not as a stranger, not even as an executive, but as someone who had fought for a promise to be kept. She visited the kitchen and thanked the dishwasher who had slipped her a sandwich on her first day, unaware she was the CEO. She stopped by the service elevator where she had once been misdirected, smiling now at the memory, not because it was funny, but because it no longer defined the place, before heading out. She returned to the front desk, now manned by a young woman named Amira, with olive skin and a quiet strength. Amira looked up and smiled. "Good morning. Dr. Pierce, safe travels?" Naomi nodded. "Very safe, very seen." As she turned to leave, Amira hesitated, then said, "May I ask you something?" Naomi paused. "Of course." Amira lowered her voice. "How did you stay calm that day, when she said what she said to you?" Naomi exhaled slowly. "Because I knew something she didn't." "What's that?" Amira asked. Naomi leaned closer, not whispering, but lowering her tone so only Amira would hear. "That power doesn't scream. It doesn't throw things. It doesn't need to prove itself." She tapped gently on the counter. "Real power. Corrects. Quietly. Permanently." Then she smiled and walked out the glass doors of the Hotel Satcher, stepping into the golden morning light of Vienna. Her driver was waiting with the door open, but Naomi turned back once more, just for a moment, and looked up at the historic facade. The building hadn't changed, but the people inside had, and that's what mattered, back in New York, 2 weeks later. Naomi sat in her office at Phoenix Lux, reviewing new expansion files. One folder caught her eye, a property in Florence facing similar internal complaints. She reached for her pen, paused, and then wrote one note in the margin: "Send Angela." She knew Angela would carry the standard forward, not the standard of perfection, not the illusion of luxury, but the standard of decency, of dignity, of human worth. As she leaned back, Naomi glanced at the framed newspaper article on her wall. It wasn't from Forbes or the Times. It was a small Viennese paper with a headline in bold black font. Hotel Sacker's Quiet Revolution, 1 woman, 10 minutes, and a legacy of change. And below it, a quote from a former staff member that Naomi had never forgotten. She didn't come to take control. She came to give it back to those who never had it. That was her legacy. That was her real title. Not CEO, not owner, but restorer. And that, above all, was the standard she left behind. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes in quiet strength and lasting change. Drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. And if you haven't yet, hit that like button and subscribe for more true-to-life stories that matter. Until next time, take care and stand tall.